Even giants start with baby steps on this episode of NES Works. Okay, so the NES's first flirtation with third-party publishers didn't fare so well. In fact, compared to the earliest third-party content to appear on Famicom in Japan back in 1984, what we got here was downright miserable. Over in Japan, they kicked things off with interesting platform puzzlers like Nuts and Milk, a conversion of the hot new Apple II hit Lode Runner, and arcade classics such as Pac-Man and Galaxian. We, on the other hand, got two awful wrestling disasters, a sluggish platformer, and a single, genuinely decent action game. What makes this especially baffling is that Famicom's early days were the Wild West, and Nintendo had no real control over other publishers' releases there. Meanwhile, they went to great lengths to limit and filter what showed up on NES in America. By all accounts, the NES's early licensees should have knocked it out of the park, with 2 years of Famicom hits to choose from and Nintendo itself pushing to keep quality high. Instead, all of those safeguards left us with a sudden influx of the crummiest third-party games to have appeared on Famicom, and seemingly none of the timeless classics. Disastrous, right? Well, not entirely. I think we can look at the bumpy fall 1986 release calendar as a simple case of working out the kinks in the system. That, and the fact that Bandai was the most aggressively opportunistic publisher in Nintendo's stable, and also the company with the strongest business presence in the US thanks to its existing toy business. So these frustrations have been really more of a matter of happenstance. And anyway, a rocky start doesn't mean a perpetual failure. If we expected every console to live or die by its launch lineup, Dreamcast would have survived a lot longer than PlayStation 2, and we all know how that went down. No, we'll soon see far more impressive third-party releases for the NES, we just need to get beyond these launch doldrums. We all know how great the NES lineup would eventually become, thanks in large part to third parties, and when we look back at the era, a handful of publishers stand above the rest: Capcom, Konami, HAL, and a few others. Two of those best-in-class game makers got their foot in the door here near the beginning. We'll see Konami make its debut by the end of 1986. Meanwhile, Nintendo's other reliable super partner, Capcom, enters the NES market here with a trio of releases in November of 1986. Unfortunately, their debut title is as dicey as anything Bandai gave us, or perhaps more appropriately, as dicey as Data East's first offering. As with Tag Team Wrestling, Capcom arrives on NES with some questionable ports of beloved arcade games, including this conversion of 1984's shoot-'em-up sensation, 1942. Capcom's first 3 games all appear to have shipped together in November '86, but 1942 seems appropriate to designate as the first of these releases. Not only was the arcade version the company's international breakthrough hit, but the Famicom version marked Capcom's home console debut in Japan. 1942 arrived on Famicom in Japan in December '85, a fairly snappy turnaround for a Smash arcade release from a company that, until then, had existed strictly as an arcade manufacturer. In fact, Capcom had only been around for about a year and a half as an entity by the time they entered the Famicom market, having made their debut in May '84 with the top-down shooter Vulgus. In a very real sense, you can say Capcom grew up in parallel to the NES and Famicom, maybe more so than any other publisher in the biz. The company debuted in arcades around the time that third parties were first appearing on Famicom, and it launched its first home game right as the NES hit the American market. Given the company's modest size in those early days, though, it perhaps should come as little surprise that Capcom didn't, or couldn't, initially commit many resources to home console development. As with many publishers then, it outsourced its early releases to silent external partners, not unlike Nintendo itself had done with games like Donkey Kong, in fact. Quite a number of ghost house developers emerged in Japan in the late 70s and early 80s to take advantage of the rapid expansion of the video games market. Many companies getting into the biz weren't inherently focused on creating entertainment products and found it easier to outsource their projects to dedicated studios. Tosei, who produced 3 of the initial 4 third-party NES titles, is perhaps the biggest and most prolific of these silent partners, but they were hardly alone. And Capcom put this practice to use as they made their move into the console space. Rather than going with bigger firms like Tosei or Ikegami Shusenki, or using second-party contractors from the early first-party days, such as HAL or PAX Softnica, Capcom outsourced its initial NES games to a studio called Micronics. There's not a lot of firm information about Micronics online, The company seems to have changed its name to Chaos with a K in the early 90s before vanishing altogether. And none of the nearly 36 games Micronics and Chaos programmed are particularly well regarded, so it should come as little surprise that no one has stepped up to claim credit, or rather blame, for those works. Micronics seems to have been based in Japan's Kansai region, given that they mostly worked with Osaka-based firms like Capcom and SNK. And it's awfully tempting to believe the claim that the Game Developers Research Institute dug up from the Japanese side of the internet, suggesting that Micronics was in fact a single college student dabbling in contract work on the side. Certainly Micronics productions have an air of late-night college project about them. They're sloppy, even amateurish. Tosei's games didn't exactly set the world on fire, but even Muscle demonstrated a pretty reasonable level of technical competence. As we see with 1942, however, Micronics games demonstrate jarringly poor frame rates, suffer from massive glitches, and generally have a profound sensation of jank about them. And so it goes with 1942, which on NES amounts to a poor rendition of a great game. The arcade version helped catapult Capcom to international celebrity, yet this adaptation is a pale, flickering shadow of that creation. Some of 1942's failings are subtle, while others are more glaring. For example, you'd have to be practically comatose not to notice what's happened to the game's soundtrack. The arcade game had a fairly minimal soundtrack, unsurprisingly for an arcade work from 1984. The background music was meant to have a martial feel, with snare drums and steel whistles playing out in short staccato bursts, almost like Morse code. The NES version attempts to replicate that poorly. The snare drum is a thin drizzle of static, and the grating melody, such as it is, loops endlessly and frequently with a shrill quality that will absolutely drive you buggy. You also can't help but notice the aggressively terrible frame rate. This was something of a Micronics trademark, it seems. Character sprites have a tendency to skip and stutter about the screen in their games rather than moving smoothly. The NES, at least on NTSC screens, ran at 60 frames per second, but objects within 1942 move around at a much lower rate, causing them to jump from position to position every few frames. Of course, this still happens within a fraction of a second, but it does create a visually perceptible sensation that everything you see is kind of sputtering along, and in a fast-paced shooter like 1942, it also creates a sort of sticky feel to the action that detracts from the game. But the one thing you can say in favor of 1942's tech is that sprite flicker is fairly minimal. That's down to the nature of the game, though, not a credit to the programmer. The NES's sprite display limitations had to do with the number of objects drawn in a horizontal line, and that tends not to be much of an issue in a vertical shooter like this. Far more subtle are the numerous glitches you'll experience throughout the game. There's pretty much no part of 1942 on NES that doesn't screw up at some point or another. Even the game's most basic function is affected. Your plane often fails to shoot when you press the fire button. The game will play the sound effect, but no bullets emerge, a serious issue in the thick of combat. Power-ups seem particularly prone to failure. Sometimes you'll collect a power-up icon, and nothing will happen. The Wingman upgrade, which causes 2 tiny ally planes to fly in from off-screen and flank your craft, demonstrates all kinds of bad behavior. Sometimes only a single Wingman will appear. On other occasions, one of them will fail to make its proper arc toward your plane when it appears, instead flying off-screen in a straight line, never to be seen again. On the plus side, sometimes the game will register a power-up as being collected and grant its effect to you while you're halfway across the screen. So that's something, I guess. Even without these technical errors, power-ups are poorly distributed. There are about 5 different kinds of power-ups in the game: wide shot, wingman, 1-ups, smart bombs, and more. But rather than being spread somewhat evenly across the stages, you'll almost always see multiples of the same type of power-up within a given stage, and then it won't appear again for several more levels. In the arcade version, handy upgrades like extra firepower appear fairly frequently. Here though, you'll see the firepower boost twice in rapid succession in a single level, making its second appearance practically useless since it doesn't stack with the first, and then it won't show up again for another 4 or 5 stages. This is the case for practically every power-up type, which is a bizarre and frustrating shortcoming that undermines the game. It doesn't help that power-ups only appear when you play from the beginning of a stage. If you die and resume from a mid-stage checkpoint, you'll almost never see power-ups until you reach the following level. Despite these flaws, 1942 plays tolerably in the early going, as you take on simple enemy waves over the blue of the ocean. After a few stages, however, the action becomes more intense, with increased enemy wave patterns and attacks, but around the same time you begin flying over land formations. The islands and atolls you pass over feature lots of sand, frequently dotted with tiny trees, and the color choices and general busyness of the land area graphics make the game far more difficult than it ought to be. Many planes and projectiles blend into the background when you're not flying over water. I suppose the one saving grace for 1942, at least at the time of its original debut on NES, is that, back then, it was about as good as shooters got on consoles. There weren't any other similar games to hold it up to on NES at that point, and compared to vertical shooters of the previous console generation, 1942 at least featured a large number of enemies and an interesting, if poorly implemented, power-up scheme. This version holds up poorly now, yes, but at the time I guess it was technically better than nothing. And in fairness, the underlying game really was strong, even if this version presented it sloppily. 1942 wasn't Capcom's first vertical shooter, but it really stood out amidst a rapidly burgeoning field of Xevious wannabes thanks to a few different factors. First, the premise. Rather than involving some sort of wild sci-fi outer space premise, 1942 took place in, well, 1942. Players controlled an American Mustang jet fighter, gunning down endless waves of Japanese Zeros, a detail that becomes especially notable when you realize it was developed by a Japanese company. I can't imagine any American studio ever producing a game about US Army troops being slaughtered by a single hero foreigner, and in fact 1942 flies in the face of an entire Japanese pop fiction subgenre that reimagines glorious Yamato as the victor of World War II. So yeah, 1942 is kind of weird. The game keeps things pretty simple. You control a single plane with a few simple power-up options and the ability to perform a limited number of loops to pull your bacon out of the fire in a pinch. The loop renders you momentarily invincible, but it tends to be less practical than that might suggest. There's a good chance your loop will cause you to swing back around into an enemy or into a heavy field of fire. Enemy craft appear in increasingly complex waves as you advance. You begin by dealing with small planes, some come straight at you, while others demonstrate Xevious-like behavior and peel away while firing once your paths intersect. Other planes fly in various loop formations, wide circling loops for example. And advanced futuristic planes that show up in the second half of the game combine the tactics of lesser planes to create an even greater threat. You also have to deal with larger planes whose size changes the flow of the action. Mid-sized planes approach usually from the bottom and fly in a straight line. They're not difficult on their own as they don't attack, but you have to avoid colliding with them. These planes create barriers and obstacles to avoid on screen, breaking up the screen space and boxing you in. This becomes especially true when a formation of several planes flies up the center of the screen, effectively hemming you into one half of the screen. A much greater threat comes in the form of the larger bomber-type aircraft that also approach from the bottom and dominate the screen. Unlike the medium planes, these don't simply fly away. Instead, once they reach the top half of the screen, they begin moving back and forth in a wave pattern, unleashing a spread of bullets until you destroy them. And then, every 6 stages, you have to take on a boss, a gigantic bomber that sprays the screen with bullets. It seems deadly and intimidating until you realize that its tail gunner can't hit you if you hover right below its wings blasting it, but it's a nice try and looks impressive. The game ultimately proves to be incredibly repetitive in any incarnation, arcade or NES. It consists of 32 stages, and the only real variety comes from the increasing complexity of enemy patterns, not to mention the occasional eye-searing background detail. The original version of 1942 was conceived by a man named Yoshiki Okamoto, a former Konami designer who jumped ship to Capcom early on and would go on to head up classics like Final Fight and Street Fighter, along with Mobile Smash Monster Strike. 1942 was his first big hit, and it deserved a better port than this. But Capcom was still a tiny company back then, still getting its ducks in a row for a serious bid in the home gaming space. You gotta crawl before you can walk, and you gotta outsource arcade ports to questionable ghost developers before you can redefine the medium with cutting-edge original creations. It's hard to see how great Capcom's NES games would eventually become from this ramshackle production, which feels like it's about to fly apart in any second. It was barely adequate at the time, and it's unbearable today. On the next NES Works, Micronics phones it in again, but somehow manages to achieve a critical technological milestone for the NES at the same time.